you ever struggled to forgive somebody? I know I have in my life, in my family, my workplace, school, religious life. It's a constant struggle at times, to forgive others. And I'd like to share a story that a friend of mine from Japan told me. It was about a man who was dying. He was on his deathbed, and his family called in a man who was known to be a mystic, a Catholic mystic in Japan. This story goes back probably 30, 40 years ago. And so the man came in, and this mystic and was praying with the dying person. And instead of praying for his healing, he told the man, he said, I want you to write down the names of all of the people in your life that you need to forgive. All of the people with whom you are holding a grudge. The people that you have resentment towards. And the family was actually furious. They basically ran him out of the hospital room, and the man was angry that this man would come in and tell him he needed to write down the names of all these people. Well, after a while, maybe a few days, this dying man thought the better of it and decided to go ahead and do that. And so he began writing the names, thinking of all the people he needed to forgive. And I mean, he filled pages and pages. In the end, when he had finished writing out all these names and chose to forgive all these people, he was healed. He did not die from his ailment. And this is kind of a parable for us. It's a parable of the need to forgive. St. Bonaventure tells us that resentment, which is the alternative to forgiveness, if we harbor a grudge, if we let rancor foment in our hearts, that this resentment, St. Bonaventure tells us, has a built-in punishment. It's a little foretaste of hell. I mean, just imagine for eternity resenting the people that tried to help you, resenting people for what they did to you, how they misled you, resenting even God for the gift of life. Our Lord says of Judas that it was better for him that he never existed, he never was created, that he was never born. And that kind of indicates the hell of Judas and the hell of the tormented souls is that they resent God for loving them into existence. They resent him for having made them to know, love, and serve him in this life and be happy with him forever because they chose to reject God's plan. And so resentment is an ugly feeling, and we know that. When we have a grudge, when we have resentment, every time we think of the person, see the person, hear the person, that resentment, that ugly feeling is in us, and it's punishing us. Whereas when we forgive, we're free. We experience the freedom of the children of God. And so knowing this, and having been a priest for over 20 years and just encountered and counseled so many people over the years and heard stories of bitter resentment and anger and harboring grudges, etc., I've been working on writing a song, which is a prayer asking our Lord for that grace to forgive from the heart. St. Paul says to the Colossians, forgive one another as the Lord has forgiven you. And that's the principle. That's the principle. Our Lord, when he taught us the Our Father, he says, pray, not like the pagans, but pray that in this way, Our Father who art in heaven. And he goes on and says to pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So it's a condition for our own forgiveness is to forgive others. In fact, our Lord even tells the parable of a man who had a debt with his boss, and the boss comes in and demands that he pay it, and the man pleads and begs him to be patient, to pardon him, to give him time, whatever, to show mercy. But then that same man who receives the pardon, receives the forgiveness, he goes out to one of his servants who owes him a fraction, literally a fraction, like a penny compared to $1,000,000, owes him a penny. And he, basically throttles him and has him thrown in prison, etc. And our Lord says that the boss finds this out and basically revokes his forgiveness because he wouldn't forgive another man, and hands him over to the torturers. And our Lord concludes the parable saying, "And thus will the Lord do to you unless you forgive your brother from the heart." And that's the key. That's the key. That's what we want to pray for, is the grace to forgive our brother from the heart. I'd like to share a story I heard from a sister, a Franciscan sister, and she was giving a talk to a group of youth, but I was very attentive listening to her talk and benefited greatly from it. And she was saying that in the convent, in her community, there was a sister that she was struggling with, and she had these feelings of anger towards her, and she wanted to forgive the sister, but every time she would try to pray for that sister, these bitter feelings would come. In other words, praying for the sister became a source of temptation for her, a temptation to more resentment. And so what did she do? So she couldn't pray for the sister because when she prayed for her, she would get these feelings of resentment and be tempted not to forgive, and all the wounds would come back. So she decided, well, what I'll do is I will light a candle in front of the Sacred Heart of Jesus for this sister every day. And so that's what she did. Every day she just lit the candle. Now she didn't say prayers, she didn't think about the sister, she just lit a candle. And I thought this was very creative and ingenious, really, of her, and showed her genuineness, her desire to forgive, her desire to experience that healing. And so each day she lit that candle, and she was sharing with these youth, and she said, eventually, as I lit that candle, I was able to say a prayer for the sister. And then eventually, she said, I was able to sort of forgive and move beyond that and experience that healing that comes from letting go and letting God, from forgiving my brother from the heart. And so you remember the St. Peter, he grasped this message. He grasped this message so profoundly, and he wanted to live it so perfectly that he asked our Lord, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother? And he asked him, he says, Lord, 7 times? And I know St. Peter sometimes gets a hard knock in homilies. Priests, I've heard them say, oh, St. Peter only was willing to forgive 7 times, and our Lord corrects him. But when you think about it, I've met people that aren't willing to forgive once, let alone twice, 3 times, 7 times. And 7 for the Jews was a number of perfection. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. So it's a number of perfection. So St. Peter was willing to forgive the perfect number of times, and he was asking our Lord if this was correct. And our Lord says, no, you must forgive 70 times 7. In other words, there's no limit to our forgiveness. Now, just a little pearl of wisdom from my own experience and from having counseled and helped many along their spiritual journeys, I've discovered that 70 times 7 that our Lord is speaking of, it isn't necessarily 70 times 7 different offenses. Sometimes it can just be one offense, one offense. Some deep wound from our youth, from our childhood, and every time we think of it, every time we think of that person, we're tempted to resentment. So each time that temptation comes, it's an opportunity to forgive. So even if I'm reminded of that, even if that memory hurts and it comes back to haunt me over the years, I'm called to forgive 70 times 7. So yes, I forgive today. I forgive from the heart. I use my mind, my will, my heart, I forgive. But tomorrow, if that memory comes back, I might be tempted back to resentment again. So I have to forgive and forgive and forgive. Now, I do want to conclude with something else that's important too. Sometimes we get the impression that, well, we're supposed to forgive And that means that we're just supposed to be a doormat. In other words, somebody is abusive to me or loved ones, I'm just supposed to forgive and not pay any attention. That's not what our Lord is saying. Absolutely not. Forgiveness does not mean ignoring injustice. Forgiveness does not mean being a doormat, just being abused, whether it's verbally, sexually, physically. That is not what our Lord's calling us to do. No, we are called to forgive from the heart. We forgive. But we also need to create healthy and safe boundaries in our relationships. Boundaries where we are comfortable and also respect the other person. And sometimes that means constraining orders. That means separation. We can forgive a person and still protect and guide ourselves in our own lives. It's very important. I mean, even, for example, in relationships always involve boundaries, healthy boundaries. When God creates Adam and Eve, he tells them they can eat of all the fruits of all the trees in the garden, all of them, except one. You are not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Notice, even in the state of innocence, original justice, original innocence, Adam and Eve were given a boundary by God. Boundaries make for good relationships. And so it's not easy always to create them or maintain them. Not everybody will understand them, but it's the best thing for them and for us if we have those healthy boundaries. And in that context, we are able to forgive transgressions without giving away our dignity as the children of God.
Lord, how many times must I forgive my neighbor? 70 times 7, you must grant the favor, unless you forgive your brother from the heart. How can my Father forgive you unless you